Good morning, everyone. I'm Erica Resnick, the Assistant Director of the Temple Emanuel Stryker Center, and I'm excited to welcome you to the first of the programs we're offering this semester to mark Israel's upcoming 73rd birthday next month. There's so much to celebrate and still much to worry about. So our guests in this series of conversations with prominent Israeli women and in our forthcoming conversations with family members of Israel's leaders will look both backward and forward to where Israel has been, where it's going, and the challenges that the country faces. We are honored that our dear friend Ido Aharoni, a veteran Israeli diplomat who was the longest serving Israeli consul general in New York, will serve as moderator for these important conversations. If you have questions for Ido or our speaker, you can submit them via the chat function. For those of you watching directly on Zoom, we are proud that this webinar features closed captioning. To activate, simply click the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen, then click Show Subtitle. The size of the subtitles can then be adjusted by clicking Subtitle Settings. You can also click Hide Subtitles to disable the feature. Please now welcome Ido Aharoni and Yuli Tamir.
Thank you so much, Erica, for this very, very kind introduction. I'm so happy to be hosting as the first woman leader in our country, my dear friend, Professor Yuli Tamir. I'd like to start, although all of you had a chance to review her amazing achievements online, just a few words about her. On top of the fact that she is my friend and her daughter worked with me, extremely talented. Yuli is a wonderful example of leadership in Israel. She was a leader in her academic and intellectual work as a professor of philosophy who specializes in the philosophy of education and other areas. Tenured at Tel Aviv University. Later on, she became the president of Shenkar School of Design. And now she's the president of one of Israel's most esteemed colleges, the Bet Burl College, named after Burl Katzenelson, who was one of the thinkers of the labor movement. In between, she was also very active in politics and shaping the lives of many Israelis, most notably as a former minister of education and one of the founders of the Peace Now movement many, many years ago. And this is something that we will talk about. Born and raised in Tel Aviv, she now lives in Tel Aviv. Welcome, Professor Yuli Tamir, my dear friend.
Thank you for inviting me to be with you.
You know, Yuli, we have hundreds of people and they keep on coming on this call, which is just a sign to show you how interested people are in Israel and in you personally. So the first question I have for you, obviously, is about your own background, your own life story. If you can share with us, the beginning. Where were you born, your upbringing, your family, your personal life?
I didn't hear the beginning of your question, but I assume it was my own personal sort of
Yes.
biography. There was a disconnection for a second. As you said, I was born and raised in Israel. My family was one of the founding families of this country. My mom's uncle, Moshe Sharet, was the second prime minister of Israel. So I grew in a very deep-rooted Zionist family, and I think I owe a lot to this upbringing that I feel very connected to Israel, very connected to its destiny, sometimes very worried about its destiny, and very much committed to try and change it for the best as much as I can.
Now, you mentioned Moshe Sharet. To those of you who don't know, Moshe Sharet was Israel's second prime minister. His original name was Shartok, and he was very unique. He was unique in the sense that he really believed in diplomacy in its genuine meaning diplomacy is the absolute opposite of war. He spoke Arabic fluently because he was raised by an Arab family for a couple of years. And would you say that he influenced you?
I think he influenced me a lot, and the family had a sort of the myth of the family was about coming to Israel in order to coexist with the Arab community that was living here. Actually, unlike many other families, in the first few years in Israel, they lived in an Arab village called Insigne, just near Birzeit University. They had a house there, which they left in the 40s and went back to Tel Aviv. And after the Six-Day War, we came, the whole family, to visit the house and steal their piano and all their sort of little things they brought from Russia was there in the family living room. And it was a very moving sort of meeting. And it's always, the message in the family was, we came here in order to live with the Arabs. And though we are in conflict, we have to find ways of working with them, talking to them, respecting them, because we have a shared destiny.
Now, let's start with your academic career. What drew you to the academic work, and what areas were you mostly interested in as a young academic?
Actually, I started my life in mathematics, and then went and did an MA in molecular biology. But then we created Peace Now, and I became more and more engaged in politics, and I left my scientific sort of career behind and went to study political science, and then did a PhD in philosophy at Oxford. So I think Peace Now was a turning point for me. I realized I would like to do something that allows me to engage in public affairs and to advance as much as I can the peace process in Israel.
So tell us about the impetus of the foundation of Peace Now to our viewers who are not familiar with the history of Israel's peace movement. What was behind it? How the whole thing started?
The whole thing started really very innocently. We were all students that were actually just finishing our army service. We were all soldiers during the Yom Kippur War. Many of us were in the front line. I was an officer, intelligence officer in Sinai. Obviously, a lot of the men were involved in the fighting, and we came back from the war very angry and disappointed with our own leadership. We had felt that the opportunity to talk to Sadat and to make a peace agreement was missed, and that we have paid a very, very high price personally and nationally. And when Sadat wrote this letter to Begin saying he is willing to renegotiate, we created ourselves basically as a letter of soldiers, of officers in the army saying to Begin, we're ready to fight for Israel. Some of us, unfortunately, died for Israel, but we will not do it again unless we are absolutely sure that you do everything within your powers to make peace. So that was the beginning, and it was really 10 students sitting on the grass writing a letter, which immediately created a huge, huge echo, and many people joined, and within a few weeks, we became a public movement. I was 24, we were very young, inexperienced, but I think that was also what made us so popular, because nobody suspected that we have any other intention but to express our pain and our preferences. And it became a movement that had quite a lot of influence in Israel in some turning points, especially the peace with Egypt. But after the war in Lebanon, the big demonstration against Sharon and Begin, when Begin said, I can't bear it no more, he also responded to the fact that we were basically living in the street outside his house with signs of how many people died in Lebanon. So it was an effective movement, not effective as we would have liked it to be, but quite effective in the days.
So Peace Now was not really part of the political establishment. When did you decide to make the transition from something that was a grassroots movement to established political life?
Well, I didn't. This decision was made for me. I was kicked out of Peace Now, which is a sort of a now sounds like
tell us about it. This is interesting.
It sounds like a sort of an awkward story. I was sort of the spokesperson of Peace Now in the sort of in the diaspora, bringing money and talking to people about Peace Now. And I was sent to Austria, where we had a big donor, and I met there Issam Sartawi, who was one of the leaders of the PLO and actually one of the people who pushed the PLO towards negotiations with Israelis. I was there with Eddie Zucker, and we had a meeting with him. And when we came back to Israel, this was not a planned meeting. We came to the house of our donor, and Sartawi was there. When we came to Israel and talked about it, we were actually expelled from Peace Now, because at the time, it seemed like a very, very extreme act. So we were sort of lost, and Shulamit Aloni picked us from the street and said, do you want to join me? And we ran with Shulamit Aloni. Unfortunately, she got only one seat. I got pregnant. This is no relationship, by the way, just happened at the same time. And I went back to the university and then went to do my PhD and came back to politics many, many years later.
So you, for our viewers who are not familiar with the history, it was illegal for Israeli citizens.
No, it wasn't. It was before it was illegal, but it was unacceptable. Okay. It became illegal because of us.
It became illegal because of you. Okay, so how did you feel when under Yitzhak Rabin in 1993, early 1993, very hastily, I should say, the Israeli legislature, the Knesset, passed a law that made it legal for Israelis to meet with PLO officials. It was meant to allow Israeli negotiators, but the Israeli public wasn't aware of it at the time. How did you feel when the law was changed?
I was delighted. I was doing second track negotiation and meetings all the time. But, you know, when it was officially changed, it was a change of hearts and minds. People understood that talking to the Palestinian is good for Israel. It's something that we need to do if we want to secure our future. So I was obviously delighted, but don't be mistaken, Rabin never liked what we did, and Rabin never liked Peace Now. He was a very close friend of my family. He studied with my mom. As a child, they were very close, and every time I came into the room, he said, I know you guys, you are too extreme for me.
So, but yet somehow you find yourself years later as part of labor movement. How did that happen?
Yeah. I was actually teaching in the States until Rabin was assassinated. I came here to Israel just for the weekend when he was assassinated. I was very much affected by this event. I was in the square and I decided to come back. So I notified I was at Harvard at the time. I came back and started to work with Ehud Barak, writing his social economic platform. And he ended up inviting me to join this government when he created a government. I was not a politician then. I had no political background. I was purely a political theorist, but I joined the government, and that was the first move into real politics.
You know, many people, including, great luminaries like Henry Kissinger and others, transitioned from the world of theory to the world of practice. How was this transition for you?
It was, in the beginning, it was quite shocking. And, I knew really nothing about politics. I came into the government on Thursday. On Sunday, there was a budget debate. And, I'm a scholar. They gave me this, all these very, very thick books and said, by Sunday, there is a debate. And I I came home and said to my late partner, what am I going to do? I said, I'm going to bring you to someone who's going to help you. And he brought me to a friend of his who was the head of the treasury at the time. And I sat like all the weekend trying to understand what it is, trying to understand what a government debate looks like. And it took me some time, but I learned. But I was really, really, starting from scratch.
Now, a lot of people, especially in the United States, argue that the non-centrality of government is actually a good thing. Do you agree with that? What would you say to people that believe that governments should be less involved in determining our lives?
No, I'm a social democrat. I believe in governments. I think that the only reason we survive now the corona is because we have a public health service. I am a deep believer in public education, in public services. I think that without the help of the state, and I think we're going to see it more and more around the world, the gaps are going to grow, and the people who are left behind will be left unattended. So I believe that state services are extremely important. I've always been a public servant. I've never worked in the private market because I always believed that you can't do justice from the private market. You can do justice only from the point of view of the state.
And the same thing goes as far as you're concerned when it comes to actual influence. A lot of my friends in politics tell me that they're somewhat disillusioned that once you're in the Knesset, once you're in government, you realize that you really can't influence that much. Maybe that wasn't your case as a minister of education.
Yeah, that wasn't my case at all. First of all, you have to be realistic. You're not going to reinvent the system. A lot of people like to say, we'll reinvent the system, we'll do everything anew. But if you are realistic and you know what you want, I did the biggest school reform Israel has ever known. I've doubled teachers' salaries, which was essential, and they still are not high enough. I've changed the way we were teaching. In no place, in no other position could I do so much as I did as a minister. So I don't buy we can't do it. It's just a matter of knowing what you want to do and doing it systematically.
Let's talk a little bit about your role as Minister of Education. There's a big debate between the understanding of education and whether there's a correlation between that and the process of learning. And we all know that now with Zoom remote learning, that learning and education do not necessarily go hand in hand. What do you see as the main systemic issues that Israel's educational system is dealing with?
There's so many, but like everywhere else, first of all, is social and economic gaps. And I think the corona intensified the gaps. The children who have are much, much better than those who have not. And this is something that we should be very much aware of, that the corona and distant learning and all those things that a lot of people really were believing will change the world and make it more equal and more accessible to everyone. Now we learn that it actually intensifies the social and economic gaps. The gaps between Jews and Arabs are growing tremendously. So the first thing to do is to deal with the social and economic gaps. And then we have a lot to do because the Israeli education system is sort of being eroded, partly because we have a very high birth rate. The system can't contain the enormous number of children entering it every year. So we have very crowded classes. The corona taught us that is not a good idea. We should have smaller classes, but this is an extremely high investment. And obviously we learned a lot about how we can improve education by distant learning and other tools. So there's a lot of work to do. And from my point of view, because now I'm heading a teacher's college, That is one of the most important things that we should do. We have to work with teachers. We have to empower teachers. We have to give them tools to deal with the social issues that they are confronting. For me, Bed Barrel is the key for change, because unless you have good teachers, unless you have teachers who are able to make a difference, then you're not going to change anything in education.
Now, most notably, we have in the Israeli society an issue when it comes to education, and in general, when it comes to social and economic gaps, we have an issue with two very distinct sectors. One is, you mentioned, the Arab-Israeli sector, and the other is the ultra-Orthodox. What, in your view, and I know that you have many, many students from the Arab sector in your college, what, in your view, should we do in order to better integrate them and incorporate them into the system, the educational system, the economic system, and so on?
I think that those are two very different sectors. The Arab sectors need attention. It needs to create a sense of trust and a sense of self-esteem that will allow it to feel at home in schools and in colleges in Israel. I find the psychological state of mind of being able to participate, ready to acknowledge that you are part of a community, a precondition for learning. And now more than ever, and we in Bed Barrel make enormous attempts to make them feel at home, to be part of the community. We're now working with the president that has created this wonderful initiative of Israeli Hope after he retires from his position in a few months, to build in Bed Barrel an Israeli Hope Center in order to make everyone in the society feel at home.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this is an initiative led by current president Reuven Rivlin, and tell us a little bit about Tikva Israelit.
Yeah, I find it one of the most amazing initiatives that the president has ever, initiated in Israel, because it brings it. First of all, it acknowledges that Israel is divided, as he says, to 4 tribes, and the 4 tribes do not interact. And by the way, do not study together. They do not go to the same school system. They do not meet each other. They do not converse with each other. So he started a program that really brings together the different communities. For me, for example, when I see as part of this project an Arab teacher teaching in a Jewish school, and the whole schools, it becomes like a normal thing, which is not really the case in Israel, and people treat her as the admired teacher rather than an Arab, then I know that I don't know how many hundreds of children have changed their mind about what Arabs are. And when I see a Jewish teacher teaching in an Arab school, this is a very different experience for the children. So we want to continue his working school and try to change the atmosphere, because the conditions here are not that good, and there are lots of suspicion and hatred between the different communities. And for me, this is a precondition for Israel to be a civilized country, that we all learn how to live together. And the Arabs are willing to be partners. It's difficult, but they're willing. With the ultra-Orthodox, the situation is different. They are excluding themselves. Though I should tell you that in Bed Barrel, we have hundreds of ultra-Orthodox teachers being trained. But they, for example, would not come to a joint evening or sit on the grass. They are, they keep themselves out of the sort of mainstream of the campus. But still, I'm very glad that they study in Bed Barrel, that they study in a general higher education institution. And I would like to see more of that as well. I would like to see Bed Barrel being a very diverse place, because diversity should be our power rather than our, sort of challenge.
Absolutely. How do we incentivize the ultra-Orthodox community that, as you say, is voluntarily excluding itself from the collective? How do we incentivize them because it doesn't come, at least that's my impression, it doesn't come from their rabbinical leadership.
Yeah, it's a political issue. I think many of them, if you ask them personally, they would like to become part of Israel. They would like to work, at least part-time. Certainly the women would like to work. They certainly would like to have a little bit more money and live a little bit more comfortable life. Their exposure to the general Israel society makes them a little bit sort of aware of how people live and what people do. And you know, if you go to the parks, for example, that are free, you see lots of religious families taking a hike, which wasn't, you know, in ultra-Orthodox community, this is an unusual thing to see. But they go out, they want to be part of the public life in Israel. But I think there is a political problem that keeps them away, because the way their leadership interacts now with the government pulls them away from the places where they can interact rather than pulls them in.
Now, you're one of the women in Israel's history that really reached the top. There weren't too many of them. First question is, how do you explain that? Obviously, today the situation is much better than it used to be. And secondly, if you can share with us some of your own experience as a female in leadership, you know, within the ranks of male-dominated, you know, government cabinet or male-dominated academic establishment.
I'm, you know, the beginning wasn't easy, because I was always one or two women in the cabinet, in the parliament, in the party. I think it's much better now. But I got a very good training, because I went to Oxford, and Oxford was a woman-free zone. I sort of, I came to Balliol, there were 3 women at my PhD program, where there were about 150 men. So I came and I realized that everywhere, if you're alone, it's far more difficult to succeed. And it takes a lot of effort, a lot of sort of determination to not to you know, surrender when everybody says, "Oh, really? That's what you want to do?" You know, maybe it's not for women. I was exposed to so many explanations why things are not for women, but I think I always thought that was not the case, that I could do the things I know to do, and that I should be active as far as I can. And, you know, I always had the double, you know, I as you know, I have 2 wonderful daughters, so I've sort of took them around the world, and they followed me around with my career. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think they came out quite well, so.
Oh, I can attest to that. I can attest to that. Amazing. Yuli, you raised 2 amazing daughters, and one
Thank
of them
you.
worked with me, and she was absolutely brilliant, still is brilliant. I wanted to ask you a question about, you know, many people that observe Israeli society notice that, for example, the issue of climate change is not a big issue in Israel for some reason. Israeli society is disproportionately militaristic, oriented towards the geopolitical discussion. And my question to you, in hindsight, do you think that the emphasis on the geopolitics of the Middle East took away something from the attention, the bandwidth to deal with social and economic issues, as you mentioned, closing the gap?
Absolutely. I think this is also one of the big mistakes of the left in Israel. Maybe one of the mistakes also of the Democrats in the United States is not seeing the social economic issue of lower class working people as a first priority, that made us alienated from a lot of people that should have and could have supported the labor movement. So I certainly think that we've missed a lot when we have sort of we started, I think it was a little bit accidentally because it was around a specific issue that the movement came together so much as a peace movement. But I'm pretty sure that we have to widen our horizon as a labor movement. And this is why I always, when I came into politics, I always dealt with social economic issues, with education. I thought that was an equally important, if not a more important issue for the future of Israel.
Do you view ethnocentric tendencies within the Israeli society as a big problem, like many sociologists claim?
Yeah, I think that the separation between the tribe, as the president called them, is a real threat. If we will not find a way to live with the ultra-Orthodox and they will not be incorporated to a certain extent in the Israeli society, I really fear the future of Israel. I think that in many cases they could be the reason why the state will become poorer, ineffective in its governance. And you see it right now. If you can't manage during a pandemic, when can you do something if a whole society actually reject the sovereignty of the state? So there is a huge work to be done there. And for me, this is even more frightening than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because you can see the way the demographics develops, and within 20, 30 years, there will be about 50% of the population. A state cannot survive neither as a democratic state or as a state at all if 50% of its population do not respect its sovereignty.
Yes, we have a very, very long list of questions here. So, because I'd like to be able to ask all those questions on behalf of we have a very, very engaged group of listeners and viewers. So, with your permission, I'd like to turn to a wonderful question posed by Meredith. She's asking, would you say that there is a particular philosophy of education that guides teachers and curriculum in Israeli public schools nowadays?
I think that Israel is very much child-centered, and in many ways, more than other places in the world, it is conscious of the social and emotional needs of children. So something that became very sort of fashionable around the world, social and emotional learning, it's very much the norm in Israel. And I think we put as a society children first. And we try to listen to children and sort of meet their needs. Our difficulty, as I said, is that our classes are very large and that our ability to really attend the needs of every child, it's really difficult. One of the parts of my school reform was to introduce tutorials that children would study in very small groups. I think it saves a lot of children because somebody sees them. So yeah, we are very much attuned to what children need, but we are not able in the present circumstances to follow this as a main pedagogical move.
We have another wonderful question coming in from Manchester in the United Kingdom, from Gita. She is asking about Peace Now, and if you think that a revival of Peace Now is possible / necessary.
Well, that depends on Biden, I think. Trump allowed Israel to do whatever it wants. I think that if the world is now changing and there will be more of a dialogue, a discourse of peace in the United States and in Europe, then there will be also a response coming from the people here who want to see a change. I think people were just a bit desperate in the last few years. They felt that whatever they say doesn't echo. So it's this interaction between the internal voice and the external moves that makes movement like the peace movement effective. And so maybe the conditions will change and people will be more engaged in trying to bring about an agreement.
Now, Sandy is asking, you mentioned the tribes and lack of interaction, or at least sufficient interaction between the tribes. And Sandy is asking a very interesting question about technology and the role of technology allowing cross-sectional, cross-tribal learning. And is this something that you are doing at Beth Burl? Is this something that you're advocating?
Yeah, I'll tell you a nice story of a project we're doing. We have a small project called Tarasa. Tarasa is a sort of Ido, you translate it. What is a terrasa? It's on the when
It's
the ground is
piece. It's a terrain. It's like a boulder.
yeah, and what it does, it allows everyone, every resident in Israel to tell a story about their origins and place it on the map where they live. So Jews and Arabs can tell their stories and listen to each other's story. Usually the narratives are very separated, and Jews don't hear the Arab narrative. The Arabs hear the Jewish narrative, but feel it sort of alienating. And suddenly it's on one map, and you can see that actually when you look on, sort of stories, family stories, there's so much in common. Sometimes people talk about their life, about their grandparents, about immigration, about loneliness, and it creates a very, very nice and a very different image of Israel that is actually interacting across communities rather only within its own communities. So that's a good example for me of how the technological abilities can allow us to be closer together.
And that's a beautiful segue to our next question coming from Kathy, who's asking about, yes, okay, so technology allows a cross-tribal or cross-cultural interaction. Do you foresee in the future, if you can share with us your vision for the future for mixed school systems? Because right now, as you mentioned, we have 4 different Israeli school systems. What do you think needs to happen in order for that to take place?
A massive earthquake. I don't think it will ever happen. But saying that, I think that there is a lot of work to do to bring the systems together. So even if they won't be mixed, they would be interacting with each other.
Now, what was the rationale at the beginning?
All these things have been created before the state. So each community created its own school system. There wasn't a state. So, the Orthodox created an Orthodox school system. The religious people created schools for them. It was a communal thing. When the state was erected, the school system remained as it was. Arab communities, Jewish communities, mostly secular or traditionalist, ultra-Orthodox, and Orthodox. And it remained this way, and there's so much politics in it, and the investment in it is so extraordinary that I don't think that you can easily reconstruct it. But I think the 4 tribes, the Jews, the Arabs, the Orthodox, and the ultra-Orthodox can find better ways of interacting, and that's a lot of what we do in Beth Barrel. I think that, we take into account that it's not going to be one system, but creating bridges like Jewish teachers teaching in Arab school, Arab teachers teaching in Jewish school, working together, learning together, bringing people together. That's what we can do right now.
Now, I would assume that the nation's state law that kind of downgraded officially the status of the Arab Israeli community was not helpful. Did you experience any of that in your positions in education?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the schools in Israel, especially the Arab schools, have been affected by it. There was a feeling of, I should say, really offense. They felt offended by what happened. And they felt that they were sort of losing their place in the society. There's so much effort was done before and to bring them together. And now suddenly they were pushed outside. And that was really terrible. I have to say, I'm answering a phone call because my daughter was going to be diagnosed for corona.
Feel free.
So
Please, go ahead.
I
Go
need
ahead.
to know what
I'll
happened.
just,
You talk for 2 minutes. You do it very well.
yeah. I will, if you can just mute yourself. I would just say to our listeners and our viewers that the issue of the Israeli legislature passed the nation state law, which was some people claim an unnecessary reiteration of things that are already being articulated in Israel's proclamation of independence. And the argument in favor of the nation state law was that we don't have a constitution, and we, in substitute of the constitution, we need to draft and pass in the legislature a series of basic laws. And one of them was the law that determines that Israel is indeed the state of the Jewish people, the Jewish state. And that obviously created a great deal of tension. And the law stipulates also the downgrade of the Arabic language as one of the formal languages in Israel. And I hope everything's okay, Yuli, with your
We don't
daughter.
know. We didn't get. She didn't get an answer yet, but they were all a little bit stressed. So let's hope by tomorrow we know that it's fine.
Our next question comes from Brenda about the very same issue about why is the study of Arabic as a spoken language not emphasized more in the Israeli school system to facilitate more dialogue? And I have to say that as a product of the Israeli educational system, I did study Arabic, but it was not mandatory. And I studied literary Arabic, which means that it's not the kind of Arabic I can use in my daily interactions.
I think the reason is exactly what you mentioned, Ido. Arabic is a very difficult language because it has a spoken version and a literary version. Israel for years taught written sort of more literary Arabic. The result is that we don't speak Arabic. And there's a lot of thought now to try and teach the spoken Arabic, which is less high language. There's not a lot of literature that you can read, but you can converse. And I should say that because it is such a difficult language, and because language is a problem in Israel, also a lot of Israel don't speak a good enough English. Most Arabs don't speak good enough English and good enough Hebrew. The whole linguistic issue is a very big one.
Now, Meredith is asking another question. She said that when she visited a school in Israel where students study together, and she was wondering, do teachers and principals have access to research funds, development funds, to continue their efforts to improve their school or scale up these kind of programs? So Meredith is asking a very important question. Do you need more funds?
Always. But it's a wonderful question because I can share with you something that even, a lot of people here don't know. We have started a network of schools that work with us. And these schools are research schools, then they can work on specific issues where they can really do a small scale research, analyze it, and add it to a pool of researchers that are dealing with pedagogical moves to find best practices in the different areas of learning. And this is a very new project for which we are certainly looking for some support, partly because we want to train in every school a research leader. And they will be supported academically by the school. This is something that in Britain is very common, and I think it's very important to create this very close relationship between the academic world and schools, and also between teacher colleges and schools. It is surprising how little relationship there are between teacher colleges and schools. And that is something that we are amending by creating this network. If anyone is interested, Ido will give you my email, and I will be delighted
Absolutely.
to converse about it.
I'd like to conclude with two questions coming in from both Helene and Suzanne, asking about the Palestinian schools. So you spoke a great deal about Arab Israeli schools. There's a question about the Palestinian schools, and Helene would like to know if what seems to be the successful Abrahamic Accords, if you see any connection, any correlation, and what can you tell us about the plans? And I should mention to our viewers, those of you who don't know, the overall budget for Israel's educational system is second in Israel only to the budget of the military.
Yeah, that's quite true, but we have more children than soldiers. Then at the end of the day, per capita, we're not doing that well. But yeah, we are working with some Palestinian schools. The Arab citizens of Israel are a bridge between our schools and the Palestinian schools. And it is interesting to see now that the Abrahamic agreements opened the door for quite a lot of dialogue between Palestinians sitting actually in the Emirates and Palestinian in Israel and Israelis. And next year, we're going to have a course run by Israeli Palestinian, an Arab scholar from the Emirates in Bet Barrel, about Jewish and Islamic traditions and the way they interact. So this is sort of a first move that hopefully may lead us to some greater collaboration.
I'd like to sign up to that course, and I know that many of the hundreds of people watching you right now would like to do that as well. We will let you go and deal with your family crisis. And I just wanted to thank you very much for taking the time and educating us as a former Minister of Education about Israel's history, about Israel's future. And certainly, this was a beautiful beginning of our series featuring women leaders in Israel. Next week, we're going to have a leader from the financial world and the banking world, Rakefet Rusak Aminoach. And I'd like to turn this back to you, Erica. Thank you so much, Professor Tamir.
Thank you for having me.